Look at them.
They tried to force a girl into marriage, but she rose to defend herself, and the cowboy stood with her. The dust in Silver Fall, Arizona, was a living thing. It swirled in the wind like a ghostly shroud, coating every splinter of wood, every cracked pane of glass, and every tear-streaked face. It was a town of desperate men and forgotten souls, a place where hope had long since dried up and blown away, leaving only the grit of human desperation behind. At the heart of this swirling sorrow stood Eleanor Vance, a young widow with eyes the color of a bruised twilight sky. She clutched her son, Samuel, to her breast, his small face buried against her worn calico dress. The boy was the only thing she had left, and now he too was on the verge of being taken from her. The auction block was a crude affair, a few planks of wood thrown together on the dusty main street, but it was as final as any gallows. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fear. "Folks, let's get this show on the road," the auctioneer, a fat man named Silas Thorne, bellowed, his voice grating and slick as snake oil. He was her uncle by marriage, the brother of her late husband, and he had once slapped her on the back porch of the Vance house and told her she was family for life. Promises decayed faster than fence posts in Silver Fall. "We have here the widow of the late Mr. Vance. A fine piece of stock, gentlemen, if I do say so myself. Educated, and with a boy already old enough to fetch water and tend to the chickens." A few men in the crowd snickered, their eyes raking over her body as if they were browsing a shelf. Eleanor lowered her gaze and squeezed Samuel tighter, breathing in the soft, sour milk scent of his hair, the only anchor she had left in a world that had slipped its moorings. The sun hammered down. The heat felt personal, a hand pressing her down into shame. She tried to swallow, but her throat was raw. Her father's ranch had once stretched from the cottonwoods by the creek to the iron-red ridge where the buzzards rode thermals in slow, haughty circles. He had been a kind man, too kind for the ledger men who came with their smiles and their stacked papers. He'd gambled to keep the cattle after a hard winter. Then he'd gambled to keep the ranch after a bad drive. Then he'd gambled to keep his pride after both were gone. In the end, the desert kept everything. "Who'll start the bidding? We'll begin at $100. $100 for the lot, gentlemen," Silas called, lifting his chin and showing a bullfrog's throat above his stained collar. A hulking miner with hands like knotted rope raised one meaty wrist. $150. Eleanor felt the number strike her like a thrown stone. She had never imagined the sound of her worth. She had never imagined the taste of it, either metallic and sour, the taste of a nail clenched between teeth. 200. A rancher at the back, hat brim low, spurs glinting with dust. 225, the miner growled, hitching his belt the way some men roll a shoulder before a fight. The numbers clattered up the street like loose horseshoes. Every call felt like a footstep down the gallows stairs. Silas preened. "That's more like it. A lady with skills, a child already walking, and a pedigree finer than a Sunday carriage horse." He winked, obscene and triumphant. "You'll not find better value this side of Yuma." Eleanor's knees trembled. The world blurred at the edges. She breathed for Samuel, in and out, the way she had during the longest night of the fever, when his skin had gone hot as a skillet, and she'd prayed the roof down. A sudden ripple passed through the crowd. The laughter thinned, and the mutters sharpened, as if a wind had turned and carried something colder to the skin. Eleanor looked up. A stranger had stepped out of the glare at the far end of the street. He was tall and narrow in the hips, wore his gun like an old habit, and carried himself with the kind of loose economy that comes from teaching your body not to waste anything, not movement, not breath, not bullets. His horse, a plain dun with the kind of eye that watched and remembered, stood just beyond the watering trough, reins trailing. The stranger scanned the street like a man reading a map he already knew by heart. Jake McCall. Men said his name the way they marked a boundary line, quietly, with respect, and the sense that beyond it, you should mind your step. He had come to Silver Fall a week ago, chasing a bandit who had vanished into the smoking canyons beyond the river. Since then, he had kept to himself, a cot in the back of the livery, coffee at dawn, the endless horizon for company. His face was a ledger written by wind and time. If there was softness in him, it did not sit where a man could see it and mistake it for invitation. Silas forced a laugh, too loud. "Don't be shy, gentlemen. The lady's not getting any younger." "$250, called the rancher. $300, the miner barked, as if volume could buy him more of her. Across the street, a door creaked and a figure waddled out from the gloom of the saloon. Jeremiah Vance, called the butcher, though he had never taken a cleaver to beef in his life. He took it to people. He was a cousin on her late husband's side, the kind of family the Lord warns a woman about if she's listening. $350, Jeremiah announced, oily satisfaction oozing around the words. He smiled at Eleanor like a wolf smiling at a fence it has already found the loose rails in. Got to keep kin close. The old weaver who sold mended harnesses on the corner shook his head slowly, lips moving with a prayer that couldn't figure out which word to land on. Silas rubbed his hands. $3.50. Any advance on $500? The word was not loud, but it cut as if the street itself had sharpened an edge and passed it along. Every head turned. Jake McCall stood with his thumbs resting easy on his cartridge belt, hat tipped just enough that his eyes were shadowed. But the set of his jaw, the way he planted his boots in that powdery dust, said he had already put down roots in this moment and would not be moved. $500? Silas croaked, as if the figure had reached into his throat and squeezed. For the lady, Jake said, and the boy. Jeremiah's face went a slow, dangerous red. You're out of your lane, Hunter. Jake's eyes slid to him, flat and green as a river on a cloudy day. I'm in the only lane that matters. Oh. The crowd shuffled, the sound like dry leaves pushed by a tired broom. The schoolmarm stepped out of the mercantile door and gathered two little girls in close. The farrier leaned his elbow on the hitching rail and looked interested for the first time all day. Silas swallowed so hard his chin jumped. $500 it is. 1,000, Jeremiah barked, shoving through the men who smelled of sweat and iron filings. And I'll take the whelp with her. 2 mouths make bigger chores. Oh. There was a small, collective intake of breath. The number was ridiculous. It wasn't about money anymore. Eleanor felt the world go quiet inside her. She had thought terror the deep bottom. Turns out humiliation dug a little lower, right around the spine. She pressed her lips to Samuel's hair and tasted salt. It's all right, she whispered into the whorl of his ear, lying because mothers are allowed that grace when the truth is a weapon. Jake didn't look at Jeremiah. He looked at Silas Thorne. You got the nerve to take that money? He asked softly, as if he were asking about the weather. You got the ledger for it? Silas's eyes flicked left and right. There were men in the crowd he owed. There were others who owed him. Debts are a web, and webs hold until something stronger tears them. He's a bounty hunter, Jeremiah spat, voice cracking around the word like it was a slur. Not fit to bid on a sack of grain, much less. I'll see your 1,000, Jake said, still looking at Silas, and raise you the truth. Silas blinked. The what now? Show the paper, Jake said. The one says a woman and a living child can be sold in this town like a wagon wheel. Show the judge's mark. Show the sheriff's hand. Show the law. A silence fell that had weight. Silver Fall had law the way a graveyard has a watchman. The office had a star on the door, and a man who wore one on his vest, and some days that was enough. Some days it wasn't. Today, the sheriff was not on the street. Men's eyes slid to the jailhouse anyway, as if a star might appear if shame was strong enough. Silas' mouth worked. I'm executor of. You're a thief with a stage, Jake said. And you're done. He bent, scooped a worn leather poke from the dust, and tossed it onto the plank table before the block. The sound rang like a clean bell. 500 in coin, he said, for her freedom and his. He nodded at Samuel. And the rest, he jerked his chin toward Jeremiah, you can collect from him when he remembers what a man is. The butcher laughed. It wasn't a good sound. You figure to shame me, McCall? No, Jake said. I figure to stop you. Jeremiah's hand slid to the butt of his pistol, like a snake deciding to move. Men shifted with him, like grass flattening in the wind's direction. Eleanor felt Samuel stiffen and begin to whimper, sensing the change only babies and animals sense how a room can hold its breath before a lightning strike. Don't, Jake said. It wasn't a threat. He said it like a man might say, "Storm's coming." Just a fact put up on the fence for anyone to read. But Jeremiah lived on the far side of facts. He yanked the Colt from leather and half-cocked with a practiced flick. Jake's gun was already out and steady, two-handed, the way soldiering had taught a boy, and time had taught a man not to waste motion. He didn't aim at Jeremiah's heart. He aimed at the ground in front of him and shot once. The bullet hit the dust, kicked up a geyser that spat grit into Jeremiah's eyes. The butcher swore and staggered a step. The crowd jerked back, startled less by the violence than by its mercy. "Next one breaks a wrist," Jake said calmly. "Third one sings 10 sleep in your bones." No one moved. Somewhere, a fly landed on the back of a mule, and the mule flicked its tail with slow disdain. Far out beyond the last shack, a hawk called, thin and savage. Silas, sweating, snatched the poke. He counted enough coins to make him choke and then more, just to look busy until somebody else decided how this day would end. His mouth trembled into a terrified salesman's grin. "Sold," he squeaked. "Sold to—" "Say my name," Jake said without looking at him. "Sold to Mr. Jake McCall for $500 American dollars." Silas wobbled, half expecting lightning all the same. Eleanor could not feel her hands. She looked down and saw them white on Samuel, saw the faint tremor in her fingers like winter had crept into the veins. Jake slid his pistol away and stepped to the block. He did not climb up. He put out his arms as if he were asking for a parcel from a shelf. "Ma'am," he said, "come down off there." Her foot would not find the plank edge. She tried again and felt the wood through the thin sole of her shoe. Jake's hands were sure and gentle at her waist, and when the world tipped, he was already there at the balance point to put it right. Samuel peeked up, a wet cheek pressed to his mother's collarbone, and studied the stranger. The boy's brow puckered, then smoothed, the way a cloud breaks and becomes a sky again. "Get out of my town," Jeremiah said hoarsely, wiping dust tears from his eyes with a meat, red knuckle. "Take your street sermon with you." Jake didn't look at him. He was studying Eleanor with the concentration men give to maps before they ride into bad country. Not measuring, learning. "What's your name?" he asked, voice soft enough that she could pretend no one but the three of them heard. "Eleanor," she said, and the word came out with a crack in the middle like an old plate. "All right, Eleanor," he said. "We're done standing here. I can't pay you," she whispered, shame moving in like a cold under the door. "I can't pay you anything." "You already did," he said. His eyes lifted, just for a heartbeat, not to the butcher, not to Silas, but to something far past both an invisible grave, a broken farmhouse, a letter folded too many times. "You paid me by being here and still being a person." He turned and, without ceremony, handed Silas the rest of the poke. "For the debts that really exist," he said dryly, "the ones that don't involve selling a woman." Silas snatched it like a raccoon grabbing a bright thing and scuttled backward on his tiny legs. Pleasure doing, he swallowed the rest. Across the street, doors began to open just a little, just enough for eyes to look out and tell stories later. The schoolmarm let her girls breathe. The farrier put his elbow down. Jake looked to the edge of town where the road ran out into Glare and Ocotillo and the long spine of the desert. "We ride," he said. Eleanor flinched. "Ride? You got something you need to collect?" he asked. "Something that's yours and not theirs?" She thought of the box under the floorboard in the house. She couldn't call hers anymore, the locket with her mother's hair, the marriage certificate with the torn corner, the letter from Thomas saying when the season turned he'd come home and stay. She thought of the blue ribbon she'd braided into Samuel's newborn cap because her father had said a boy needs a mark to show the world he belongs to something. She shook her head. "The only thing I have is in my arms." She felt her cheeks flush at the admission, and turned a little so the shame would have less face to burn. "Then let's go," Jake said. He took the lead rope of his dun and handed her the reins. "Up you get." Eleanor stared at the saddle like it was a courtroom. She had ridden before, but not like this, not while the world watched, not while a man who had just shot the dirt in front of the worst man in town waited for her to put a foot in a stirrup without falling to pieces. Jake's hand was there again, light, impersonal, unhurried. He cupped her heel, guided it to the iron, then coached her from the knee. The dun shifted politely. ears flicking back. She swung up and settled. Samuel gathered tight against her. The horse was warm, real, breathing. She closed her thighs and felt strength under the saddle leather, the kind that doesn't argue but also doesn't lie. Jake put his foot in the other stirrup and mounted behind her, the way brothers ride when the trail runs narrow and two people have to move like one body to keep from going over an edge. Jeremiah took a step, rage high on his cheekbones. "You think this is finished?" Jake looked at him at last. "I think you should get smaller and cooler," he said. "I think you should learn to do that before you meet me again." A slow hiss moved through the crowd. Men who had wanted to be anywhere else now wanted to be exactly here. It is not every day you watch a man try to measure himself and get the numbers wrong. Jake nudged the dun. The horse moved with a careful, powerful stride, as if it knew the difference between walking out of town and walking into trouble. The street seemed to widen for them. Maybe it was just that nobody wanted dust on their boots from this particular crossing. They passed the church door open, shadows cool, the cross at the end of the aisle like a tall question. They passed the barber chairs empty, men inside pretending to read old newspapers while their eyeballs clung to the windows like flies. They passed the doctor's shingle and the Blackwater pump, where the water came up tasting of iron and something else you could not name. At the mouth of town, where the last boardwalk lost its nerve and stopped, Jake drew rein. He leaned close so Eleanor could hear him over the drum of her blood. "When we clear that rise," he said, chin tipping toward the sun-stunned ridge, "we run. Men like Jeremiah don't like to be told what they are in public. They'll need to say something back." Eleanor nodded. Samuel burrowed into the hollow beneath her collarbone and sighed, trusting, heavy. She wondered if she would ever sleep again, and at the same time, if she would ever wake up from this. "Can you hold the horn with your right, and the boy with your left?" Jake asked. "Yes." "Good." He turned in the saddle, green eyes scanning the heat shimmer for movement, for the way dust behaves under hoof, for the tiny betrayals of mesquite birds exploding out of a wash. "When I say down, you duck. When I say left, you lean, and don't ask why. I'll do the thinking until we're clear." She surprised herself. "And after?" "After," he said softly, "you'll do some of it with me." Her throat thickened on a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. She swallowed it because both were dangerous by now. They reached the rise. Heat wobbled off the land, bending it. Behind them, a roar swelled the clatter of men deciding their pride was a better horse than sense. Eleanor risked a glance back. Jeremiah had 6 riders with him already, and more mounting up. Silas stood very still on his block, a toad pretending to be a stone. "Down," Jake said. Eleanor folded herself over Samuel, sheltering the boy with her ribs and her will. A crack split the air, the unmistakable spit of pistol fire. The dun leapt. Jake drove his heels, and the horse found another gear, muscles rolling under them like a machine built by God with no manual. The ridge fell away into a wash braided with willow and shadow. Jake took the left fork without hesitating, the one where a cottonwood had dropped a limb and a snake had left a line in damp sand. A bullet whined past like a mean thought. Another skipped along the wash bank and spat mud at her skirt. "Left," Jake said. She leaned. The dun shouldered through a stand of arrowweed and exploded up the far side, showering sand. A hawk flashed overhead and screamed encouragement or warning out here. The two were often the same. They topped the far lip, and the world opened in a long, shimmering trough of light and distance. Jake looked once more over his shoulder, set his jaw, and loosed the dun. For a moment, Eleanor forgot her shame. She forgot the block, and the snickering, and the way a coin makes a sound when it hits a table with your life attached to it. For a moment, she was only wind and muscle and speed, and Samuel laughing against her neck, because to him, this felt like flying, and he didn't yet know how one flight can be away from something and toward something else. Behind them, the riders poured over the ridge and lost ground to the physics of a man who knew this country the way a blind man knows his own room in the night. Jake took them into a shallow draw that bent like a question mark. Gunshots dropped to sullen, baffled pops. The desert began to do what it does best, turn men into heat mirages and mirages into nothing. Only when the sound behind them softened to the hiss of sun on rock did Jake ease the dun down out of its run. He did not stop. He turned them under a shelf of stone, where the air felt a degree cooler, and the shadow laid a hand on their shoulders like an absolution. Eleanor straightened slowly, her spine arguing about it, the muscles in her thighs quivering. Jake's arm was still around her, steady, deliberate, not possessive. He eased back a fraction when he felt her find herself again. "You did fine," he said, and the praise landed in her like water. Samuel grinned at nothing, then at everything. Eleanor kissed his temple and tasted dust and baby. She wanted to cry. She wanted to sleep for a week. She wanted to march back to town with a torch and burn the block down, plank by plank, nail by bent nail. Jake pointed ahead, where the land gathered itself into a tangle of pale boulders. "There's a spring under those rocks," he said. "We'll water up and change the shape of our trail." She nodded. Then, before she could stop the words, they were out. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why me?" Jake did not look at her. He looked ahead, where heat made the air dance. His voice came slower than before, like a man stepping off a familiar path and choosing where to put his feet. "Because once, a man stood in the road and said my sister belonged to whoever could count the highest, and I was too far away to shoot the ground in front of him." He tapped the dun's neck with a knuckle, fond. "I don't miss twice." He left it there. Some stories don't need the long version to be true. They reached the boulders and slid down to their feet. The spring was a ribbon of clear water unspooling out of shadow, a miracle that did not announce itself. Jake watered the horse and filled 2 canteens. Eleanor dipped a hand and pressed cold against the back of her neck, the inside of her wrists, Samuel's cheeks. The boy gasped and then giggled, the sound carrying in the hush the way a bell's note hangs in a chapel after the priest has gone. Jake crouched, palm flat on the damp sand, reading the world in the shallow toes of quail and the lopsided stamp of a mule deer. He wiped his hand on his thigh and stood. "They'll try to bracket us where the country narrows," he said. "We won't be there." Eleanor swallowed. "Will they stop?" "They'll stop," Jake said evenly, "when the thing inside them that's hungry gets tired, or when something larger eats it." He glanced at her, and a wry light found the green. "The desert's got an appetite." She surprised herself again. "So do I." He nodded once, approval spare but real. "Good. You'll need it." He cinched the girth, checked the tie on his rifle scabbard, then reached up and put his hand on the saddle horn. "Up," he said, not unkindly. "We'll make camp when the sun breaks its back, not before." As she mounted, Samuel tucked himself into that curve between her chest and the world and sighed again, the sound of a small animal who has come to the place where the beating of a heart means safety. Eleanor looked once toward the east, where Silverfall hunched like a vulture pretending to be a town. She did not promise to forgive it, but she promised to outlive it. Jake swung up behind her. The dun shifted and settled into the work. The day burned on, bright and merciless and pure. Somewhere far behind them, a man named Jeremiah discovered that hate does not run as fast as a woman's need. Somewhere ahead, the country waited with its tests and its cold water and its sheets of stars. Eleanor set her jaw. "All right," she said to no one and to the entire world. "All right." They rode. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The escape from Silverfall was a blur of dust and pounding hooves. Jake's bay, Roan, lunged into the sage wind with the single-minded drive of an animal that understood danger the way a body knows fever, from the inside out. Eleanor rode in front of him because he'd insisted, Samuel cradled tight between her and the horn. Each stride jarred through her hips and up her spine, and yet she welcomed the pain. It was proof she was still inside her body and not drifting like ash above that cursed main street. They cut south first, then west, then south again, Jake doubling back in crooked slashes across the land until even their shadows seemed lost. He never explained the pattern. He didn't have to. Men like Jeremiah Vance hunted in straight lines and simple ideas. Jake rode like weather. Only when the heat bled from the day and the sky turned the bruised color of plums did he allow them to dismount in a fold of basalt where a thin cottonwood bent toward a trickling seam of water. It wasn't much of a spring, more of a patient leak, but the very sound of it seemed to loosen something that had been clenched in Eleanor's chest since the moment the auctioneer called her a fine piece of stock. Jake swung down, boots hitting sand with a muted thud. He lifted her by the waist, careful of the boy between them. The warmth of his hands surprised her. Not the heat itself, Arizona made ovens of all living things, but the steadiness. Many hands in her life had seized, demanded, taken. His simply placed, moved, helped. He watered the horses first. Always the horses, he said, as if anticipating judgment. They carry us farther than pride ever will. He crouched by the seep with his canteen uncapped, watching the sheet of damp sand slowly darken again as the trickle gathered. We'll fill slow, let the land keep something back. Samuel had been blessedly quiet the whole ride, a small bundle of breath and heartbeat tucked against her ribs. Now, hearing water, he stirred and let out the strangled little chirp he made before true crying. Instinctively, Eleanor swayed, shushing him with the same rhythm she'd used 100 nights alone under colder roofs than this sky. She braced for the familiar ache of not enough, never enough food, milk, sleep, and then watched in astonishment as Jake reached into a saddlebag and drew out a small tin. "Condensed milk," he said. "Not as good as you. But if you're spent—" "I'm not," she answered more sharply than she intended. The words scraped her throat. "I mean, I can feed him. Thank you." Pride could be as foolish as thirst. She knew that. But something inside her balked at accepting even a stranger's tender mercy for her child. She loosened her dress, turned slightly away, and Samuel latched with desperate gratitude. It steadied her as surely as water steadied the horses. Jake busied himself where the canyon widened to a bowl. He gathered deadfall, broke it over his thigh into even lengths, and built a small fire like a carpenter setting joints, sparing, exact, more geometry than blaze. "No tall flame," he murmured. "Light tells stories we don't want told." He struck steel to flint over a twist of charcloth and breath. His breath and coals bloomed like secret embers of a hidden forge. The smoke smelled of juniper and iron and something clean. He handed her jerky and hardtack and, after a moment's hesitation, a single precious strip of dried peach. "For him later," he said, nodding to Samuel. "I traded a trapper for it last week. Figured I'd save it for when a day needed sweetening." She ate with the fierce concentration of the truly hungry, jaw-working, eyes on the man who had lifted her off a block with 5 quiet words and a sack of gold he couldn't entirely afford to lose. He sat with one knee raised, elbows laid across it, like a man who'd learned how to rest without ever laying down his vigilance. He always scanned skyline, talus slope, the knobs of dark lava that made a ladder of shadows to the east. "You can ask," he said, without looking at her. "I have asked," she replied softly. "Why?" He drew in a breath, ribcage expanding against a shirt spattered with trail dust and a thin seam of dried blood, someone else's, she hoped. "I had a sister," he said, and told her the story he would carry the way some men wore their pistols, always within reach, always heavy. The father's debt, the sale, the fever. He spoke it not like a confession or a plea for absolution, but like a record, a ledger a man keeps, because he refuses to forget which columns matter. When he finished, the canyon was deeper in blue, and the first star had blinked awake in the east, like the small, stubborn eye of a god who hadn't given up entirely on people. Eleanor wrapped Samuel tighter, and found that tears were sliding down her nose without any sob to announce them. She wiped them angrily. "I hate that men call it debt," she said, as if a woman could ever owe what men demand from her. Jake prodded the coals. "Men owe the world for every time they make a woman believe that lie." Silence took them a while, the kind of silence that isn't emptiness but room. Cicadas rasped like blacksmith files. Somewhere a nighthawk swooped, its wing bones creaking. The day cooled around them. When Samuel slept, she laid him in the curve of her saddle and shrugged the blanket Jake offered around his small body and hers. He rose to his watch without announcing it and posted himself at the mouth of the bowl, a darker shape inside dark. "Sleep," he said. "I'll take first and last. You take middle if you can. Wake me with a whisper and your hand on my boot. No sudden moves." "Do you always live like this?" she asked. "Like what?" "Halfway between a camp and a battlefield," he considered. "Between a camp and a promise," he said at last. She dreamed badly. And then, well, in that order. Badly of Silas Thorne's fingers counting money that smelled like rust. Well of Samuel older, laughing under a cottonwood with sunlight in his hair. When she woke in the thin hour before dawn, her middle watch done and Jake already awake again as if he'd never surrendered the night. He had coffee going in a little blackened pot that looked older than both of them. "Boiled twice," he said, pouring her a tin cup. "Takes the edge off the alkali and the mean." Can it take the edge off a whole town?" she asked, and heard the bite in her voice as if it had a separate mouth. "Not unless you pour it on the bank," he said, and the corner of his mouth ticked toward a smile. They rode at first light. He set an easy pace at the start for the sake of the horses, then lengthened their stride when the sun found its teeth. At the top of a rise, he stopped and turned in the saddle. "See that?" he asked. "Which?" "Dust line east by northeast. Thin. Too steady for wind. 10 miles out, maybe more." He studied it a long time. Could be freighters, could be nothing, could be men with more appetite than sense. He cut west into country that made maps into lies, broken shelves of basalt, dry arroyos that looked like roads until they ended at cliffs, fields of cholla spines throwing little halos around themselves like saints who'd taken up meanness. He showed her how to ride with her weight a whisper and her hands low. He pointed to a ridge of red rock where vultures turned slow circles. They follow trouble like bankers, follow new money. He taught in sentences shorter than breaths, and somehow it was enough. By mid-morning, she'd let herself imagine a day without pursuit. Then she saw it, a wisp of dust crossing their back, trail at a deliberate angle, as if someone had stopped to taste the air where they'd passed, and then decided on a bearing. "Jake," she said, and it was the first time she'd said his name aloud, and it steadied her like a cedar post driven into bad soil. He looked, and the change in his body was so small that only a woman who had learned to read men the way you read weather could see it. He didn't stiffen. He aligned. He became a pattern with the country. "We keep moving," he said. "We make the ground lie for us." How they made the ground lie was a series of small obediences and cruelties. He took them down a wash, where the sand would steal the edges of tracks, then up a spill of stone where hoofprints broke into nonsense. He dismounted on a slope of shale and walked roan sideways, dragging a burlap roll from his saddle to whisk away what sign remained, careful not to look like a man careful. He led them across slick rock, where even hoof iron leaves no mark, and at the far side he used a dead juniper branch to draw odd false trails that pointed left and right like the teasing hands of a magician. They rested at noon under a ledge of lava that had frozen into ripples like cooled tar. He gave the horses nose bags so they'd not wander for graze. Samuel nursed and slept and woke and stared at the brightness with grave disapproval, as if the sun itself were a personal affront. "You and me both," Eleanor whispered to him. "We'll have words with it later." Jake chewed without interest and watched with absolute interest. He took off his hat and wiped the band with his thumb. A silvery scar tracked along his hairline. Another puckered old wound lay in the meat of his shoulder, where the shirt clung when sweat darkened it. She found herself cataloging those scars, as if they were lines in a ledger too, debts paid outward. "What will you do with us?" she asked abruptly. The question surprised them both. "Find you a town with a sheriff who doesn't sell law by the inch," he said. "Then I'll make east for a job I've owed a while." "You speak as if there are sheriffs who don't sell law." "There are," he said. "They're just hard to hire." She studied his profile. "And what are you when you're not?" "This. A man with a horse and bills and a way of making trouble for men who earn it," he said. "Sometimes they put a title on that and a paper under it. Sometimes I'd rather the paper burned." They moved again before the heat tipped to savage. In a narrow slot where the wind tunneled and made a sound like an organ, Jake raised his hand and they halted. On the wall, 6 inches above his head, a gouge had taken a bite of the rock. Fresh, pale. He didn't say the word bullet. He didn't need to. They backed out single file and cut south, then east, then south again until the slot and its echoing promise were a memory with sharp edges. Eleanor's shirt stuck to the small of her back. Samuel fussed and slept against her, his sweat smelling of salt and the sweet milk sour of life. Once, when the wind shifted, she caught a ghost of cigar smoke. She told herself it was memory. She didn't believe herself. In the late afternoon, the land softened. Mesquite gave way to grass, tufting a series of little bowls, as if some gentle hand had placed them for children to hide in. Here a spring ran true, no mere seep breaking out of a limestone shoulder with enough force to make sound. Jake reined in and sat listening for a full minute before he moved. "Coyotes," he said. "Two of them arguing with a raven. That's the music of nothing much. Good." They unsaddled and let the horses roll. Eleanor washed her face in the spring and marveled that water could be so cold this far into heat. Jake took a strip of shirt from his saddlebag and scrubbed it against a rock until the old blood came mostly out. When she glanced a question, he shrugged. "Superstition," he admitted. "I don't ride with a dead man's stain if I don't have to." "Whose?" she asked. "Didn't know his name," he said. "Only that he'd have killed a boy for the price of a set of spurs." Evening crawled in with the patience of a cat. They built another tight, intelligent fire. Jake set two little snares where the game trail pinched. He trimmed the ragged end of one rein and spliced it with a latigo strip, then showed her how to make a Honda knot for a loop that actually held. Samuel discovered his hands in the firelight and stared at them as if the maker had given him a present late and he was too polite to complain. "Hold this," Jake said, and set the rifle across her knees. He placed her hands, one under the forend, one on the wrist. "Don't fight it. Let it push you, and you push it back, the way you'd calm a frightened animal." "I've never fired a long gun," she said. "You will if you have to," he answered without drama. He pointed at a bleached stump 20 paces off. "Not tonight. Tomorrow." He told her haltingly, as if crossing a river on stones about the war. Not battles, not banners. He spoke of boots turning to paste in the rain, and the day he ate a biscuit that tasted of lye, and a boy who kept a bird's egg tucked in paper inside his hat for 3 weeks, only to cry like a child when it finally broke and runny life stained his hair. He spoke of the first time he learned the weight of a man laid across his lap because there was nowhere else to put him while the surgeon worked, and how the man's hair smelled of camphor and Sunday. "You were a boy then," she said. "I was a boy when it started," he said. "I was something else when I stopped being a boy. I haven't decided what." The wind shifted. It brought a whiff of something rancid and far. He turned his face slightly, nostrils flaring the way a horse's do. "Jeremiah," he said, so softly she thought perhaps he hadn't meant to speak. Then louder, calm again. "We'll be company before dawn." She didn't ask how he knew. Men like Jeremiah Vance left a flavor behind them like old pennies and sick whiskey. You didn't have to see him to know he was out there, moving on other men's money and hate. "Sleep," Jake said again, and because he had asked it like a gift, because nobody had asked her to sleep in months, always commanded, demanded, dismissed, she did. She woke to impact and silence, not the crack of a gun. The soft, fist-on-flesh thud of someone grabbing at a horse that wasn't theirs and getting the hoof for their trouble. Jake was already moving before her eyes understood the darkness. The fire was a faint coal wound under ash. Samuel stirred, whimpered, settled when her hand found his chest. Jake flowed to the shadow where Roan had stood, hobbled, and came up with a hand on a stranger's collar. The man made a noise that didn't belong to humans. Jake hit him once, in the place, and with the power that turns men off like lamps. Then he lowered him to the ground and bound his hands with a length of rawhide like a teacher tying up newspapers. He tipped the man's hat with 2 fingers. "Not Vance," he murmured. "One of his flunkies." He sniffed. "Rico's tobacco. Silas always buys Rico's. Cheaper. Smells like it, too." Eleanor couldn't stop the shiver that ran through her. "What now?" "Now we leave a message," he said, matter of fact. He took the man's gun, emptied it, and tossed the cartridges into the spring one by one, counting softly. Then he laid the empty pistol on the man's chest and tucked a paper under the grip. She recognized the scrap and auction notice she'd crushed and stuffed into her pocket before Jake had thrown money at her freedom. He'd smoothed it earlier to use as char kindling. Now, in the fire's glow, he scratched a single word across the blank back with a charred stick. Enough. He tucked the paper back the other way up so the printed words faced the night. He'll wake, Jake said. He'll go tell the man who owns him. And that man will make a worse decision than the last one because pride makes men stupid. You're inviting him, she whispered. I'm giving him a chance to quit, he said. Most men don't recognize the gift. They broke camp in the hush before the hush breaks. She strapped Samuel against her with the shawl so that his small heartbeat thudded against hers. The stars thinned, then thickened, then thinned again. They climbed a low ridge where the limestone wore pocks like a moon, and the grass stitched itself into fans. Jake halted at the crest and pointed. Down there, he said. See the grove. She saw nothing. Then she did. A smudge made of darker dark. What is it? A place, he said. And the word carried more than shelter. Used to be a cavalry remount camp before the army got bored with this corner of the world. There's a cistern lined with stone. Old, but it holds. We can breathe there a while. Patch. Plan. They dropped into the fold and found it almost exactly as his memory promised. 4 low walls of tumbled rock, a cracked trough dry as bone, a long dead cook fire with ash still faintly finer in the center, where grease had baked into soil years ago, and, praise be, the cistern. A circular mouth ringed with limestone blocks, half covered by a broken plank. Jake lowered a cup on a rope and brought it up dripping. He tasted, spat, tasted again, stale but clean. They let the horses drink small and often. Jake pulled 2 Army-issue tent halves from a cache of rocks, ghosts of canvas mottled with mildew and the faint stencil of U.S., and slung them low to make shade. Eleanor bathed Samuel in a hat, marveling at the way his face changed when water kissed it. He hiccuped at first, outraged, then sighed like a banker after counting interest. In that pause, in that small, stitched pocket of relief, Jake finally breathed differently, and she realized she'd grown attuned to him in ways that startled her. We'll make for Willow Bend when the sun dips, he said. There's a midwife there who also mends bullets. She owes me for a winter's worth of coal. You have debts in both directions, she murmured. That's the only way they stay human, he said. He set about the quiet business of fixing what travel and fear had frayed. He cut a strip from a worn shirt and showed her how to wrap it around the tender places where the saddle had pinched. He examined Samuel's little feet with the solemn attention of a king's physician. He scraped the iron shoes on Roan with a rasp and listened to the pitch, then nodded as if the sound had answered a question he'd asked without words. Rest, he told her then, and because he had earned the right to say it, she tried. The heat pressed her down, sleep came in slices, and in one of those thin slices she felt hands on her shoulders and woke with every scrap of fight she had. Jake's face hovered above hers, eyes narrowed, pupils big in the shade. Shh, he said, as if soothing a colt, and bent lower. He wasn't reaching for her. He was reaching for the ground beside her head where a scorpion, pale as unbaked bread, had decided the cool of her shade might suit it. He cupped it with the tin cup like a magician capping a coin, slid a folded scrap beneath, and carried it out beyond the wall. He flicked his wrist and the creature left his circle as cleanly as a word exiting a mouth. How many small violences do you prevent in a day, she asked when her heart decided not to bolt. As many as I can without spending the big ones I might need, he said. She laughed. A sound that felt brittle at first and then honest. It startled her. Samuel snorted in his sleep as if offended by joy. She stifled the laugh with her knuckles, and Jake's answering grin was quick and boyish and gone. They left at dusk, horses willing after the grace of shade and water. The world softened to the color of cooled iron. Coyotes tuned their instruments on a far slope. Jake let Roan choose the grade and then encouraged him with small sounds men make when they love animals, the useless little nonsense syllables that mean nothing and everything. Near midnight, a horned moon lifted. That was when they heard them, hoofbeats in a pack, disorganized and eager, like a drunk trying to sing harmony. Jeremiah's men were not far behind. Jake shifted a degree of angle and increased pace a fraction gentle on the beasts, urgent with his own bones. They crossed a flat of mineral crust that cracked like old paint under hoof and then dropped into a sand-bottom draw. The sound of their travel changed, muffled, and for a quarter mile the night belonged to their breathing again. At the mouth of the draw, a figure sat his horse in the V of two mesquite, silhouette cut from night. He lifted a hand, and the horse beneath him didn't move an inch. Control like that doesn't come from reins. It comes from a conversation. Jake's right hand fell, not to the gun at his hip, but to the long gun in the scabbard. He didn't draw. He let the man be a man long enough to declare himself. "Evenin' McCall," the figure said, and Eleanor didn't have to see the face to know the voice. Jeremiah, the butcher Vance, had a way of smoothing his nastier syllables as if he were always trying to sell you the dinner he'd spit in. "You been running a good chase." "Evenin', Jeremiah," Jake answered. His voice carried no heat. "You lost. Happens to men who can't read. Read this." A match flared. Jeremiah lit a cigar with relish and drew the smoke deep. The match's brief light showed a face gone florid with dust and effort. He exhaled a rope of blue, and the sweet stink of it twined through night. "You took what's mine and wrote me a love note." He reached into his vest and drew a crumpled scrap, her auction notice. "Enough," he quoted softly, as if savoring the grain of the word between his teeth. "You get to say when a thing's enough, do you?" "When it's a woman," Jake said. "And a child, yes. Men don't own those words." Jeremiah chuckled. Philosophy from a man who sells his bullets by the head. He tipped his cigar. "I'm a practical fella. I got 5 men behind me, and more work in a circle. You got 1 tired horse and 2 more mouths." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Give me the woman and the boy. Keep your pride. Ride out clean." "Oh." Eleanor felt Jake's body harden behind her, not a flinch, a setting. She heard his next breath and knew a decision had been reached in the place where real decisions live. Below words, he spoke softly, because he respected the night. "No." Jeremiah sighed like a banker denied a small favor. "Thought we'd do it the hard way." He snapped his fingers once. Hooves frothed the dark. Jake's rifle came up and fired with the kind of calm that ends arguments at distance. One man whooped and fell. Another's horse reared, screaming humanly as hot lead wrote a line across muscle. There is a rhythm to gunfights that dime novels never catch. It's not clamor but punctuation. Jake made periods where other men sprayed commas. Each shot closed something. "Down," he hissed, and Eleanor slid from the saddle with Samuel clutched sideways, rolling into the low seam of shadow where the draw shouldered against a bank. She felt the sting of gravel in her palm and the holy weight of her son alive under her chin. She wished, with a longing that seared, for 10 more minutes in which to be fearless. Lacking that, she was precise. She found the derringer in her pocket by feel and thumbed the safety catch Jake had shown her. She counted breaths. She counted the spaces between shots. She counted her life. Jeremiah fired a showy, angry blast that hit rock and spat chips. He liked noise. Men like Jeremiah always do. He shouted something about teachin', and then somebody else shouted about flank, and then there was the sound of a horse going down like a barn, massive, inevitable, lungs emptying with a noise that will keep company with you in quiet years later. A bullet snapped the air so close to Eleanor's ear that heat brushed it. She didn't scream. She pressed Samuel's head harder into the notch of her shoulder and tasted dust and the bitter coin taste of fear. She thought of the peaches Jake had saved. She thought of the word enough, written in a stranger's ash. She thought of a sister she had never had. She thought of every woman she had known whose world narrowed to the width of a man's palm. She rose to her knees in the wedge of shadow, saw Jeremiah's hat lift as he leaned to spit, and she pressed the Derringer's 2-pound trigger the way she would peel a potato, slow, committed, sure. The tiny pistol cracked. Jeremiah flinched, startled, as the ball tore a crease across his jaw and drew an immediate black line of blood. "Hellfire," he bawled, and in that outraged second Jake's second shot stitched the night and took the cigar right out of his mouth and a button off his vest for good measure. "I can keep taking small things," Jake called, voice flat, "or you can ride and keep the large ones." Behind Jeremiah someone laughed short, shocked. the sound a man makes when the idea of dying moves from concept to appointment. The laugh died as quickly as the man who'd made it. Jake punctuated again. A whistle cut the dark from the east. Men answered it with their spurs. Hoofbeats retreated in fragments. Then, as a choice, Jeremiah swore in a higher register than his speaking voice. "This ain't over," he promised a line men like him imagined to be an incantation. "You bought yourself time, McCall. That's all." "Time will do," Jake said, and the draw held its breath as the last of Jeremiah's riders let night swallow them, the way a bad debt disappears for a week and then knocks again louder. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was the body's long exhale after not breathing enough. Eleanor became aware of a small, insistent pressure, Samuel's hand pushing against the bone of her collar as if reminding it of its purpose. She laughed a little mad, relieved, grateful, and the sound broke gently instead of hard. Jake lowered into the seam beside her, close enough that she could feel the tremor in his forearm settle. "You all right?" he asked, and it wasn't a nicety, it was an inventory. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Had worse nights with better whiskey," he said, and then caught her wrists in his hands and turned her palms up in the dark. "You're bleeding." "Grovel," she said. "It's nothing." "It's yours," he said. "That never makes it nothing." He wrapped her palms with clean strips, torn from the hem of his own shirt. She watched his fingers move square, careful, the nails chewed down, a soldier's hands, a farrier's, a man's who had learned how to make and unmake pain with the same tools. "Why did he run?" she asked, truly asking. "Because he's the kind of man who grew big by scaring small towns," Jake said. Tonight he learned there's a difference between fear and aim. They didn't camp. They moved, because movement was now a sacrament. When dawn finally peeled the night off their shoulders, the world looked less like a threat and more like a ledger with new numbers in it. They reached Willow Bend close to noon the next day, a scatter of cottonwoods and 3 buildings that called themselves a town because they had a sign and a bell. A creek made a true bend here, lazy as a sun-drunk dog, and the bank wore the green that persuades travelers they might stop and soften. A small chapel, a sod-roofed house with a quilting frame set bold on its porch, and a low, long building with a red door made the place seem like a sentence composed by a patient hand. Jake rode straight to the red door and knocked in a rhythm that had a story to it. 323. After a pause, the door opened and a woman looked out, gray hair braided down her back like rope, eyes the color of good dark tea. She took in Jake first, then Eleanor, then Samuel with a midwife's total, blistering assessment that worried about lungs before reputations. "McCall," she said, "you look like trouble chose you again." "Agatha," he answered, and for the first time since she'd known him, Eleanor heard warmth that wasn't sandblasted. "I brought you more debt." Agatha's gaze softened by degrees as it moved from rifle to woman to baby. "Come in then. I like this kind." "Oh." The house smelled of carbolic and bread clean and welcome. Herbs hung drying from a beam, yarrow, comfrey, horehound. Instruments gleamed honest in a basin. On a side table, a stack of old army blankets sat folded with military precision. "You'll want water, food, and advice you don't yet know you need," Agatha announced, already moving. "Sit there." She pointed Eleanor toward a rocker, then turned on Jake with the force of a cannon. "Let me see where the stupid is leaking out of you." "Zhou." He grinned without teeth and rolled his shoulder out of his shirt as if they had done this 100 times. The flesh below the clavicle was purpled and swollen where a glancing shot had bitten him a low, mean crease rather than a mortal one. Agatha clucked. "You make a poor habit of offering your body where your bullets should go." "Ever the gentle tongue," Jake murmured. She irrigated the wound with boiled water and a splash of whiskey, then smeared it with honey and wrapped it with clean linen. "It'll knit if you don't tear it open pretending you're 20. She glanced at Eleanor. "He's not 20. "I guessed," Eleanor said, dry as a Nevada creek in August, and Agatha's mouth tilted approvingly. "Your hands," Agatha observed next, and Eleanor offered them without protest. The gravel had left a dozen little moons in the meat of her palms. Agatha plucked them out with a needle and set them in a dish. "Wear these into town later," she said, "and show the women what it costs to refuse a man his wrong. They'll pretend they disapprove and then make you twice the bread." Eleanor's throat clenched. "Do women here?" Women everywhere, Agatha said. We just do less whispering and more soup. Samuel squawked. Agatha scooped him expertly and pressed his ear to her chest, listening with the same fierce completeness she'd given the room. Hungry, she diagnosed. Offended, a little proud. She handed him back with a look that said she trusted his mother. They ate stew that tasted of pepper and forgiveness. Jake spoke in low, sifting sentences about Jeremiah, about the men, about the circle tight enough you could feel the twine burn. Agatha listened, fingers steepled. Sheriff's 3 days north, she said. The one we like anyway. The one you know not to like is closer. Thorne? Jake asked, mouth flattening. His cousin, Agatha said with country brevity, and Eleanor needed no chart to follow the genealogy of rot. What would you do if you were a man with more pride than plan? Jake asked. Ride wide, then small, and then straight, Agatha said. Men like that make nests of stupidity take comfort in returning to their own stink. She rose. You'll go east of town on the dry creek bed that looks like a road to anybody who doesn't know roads. At the cut bank you'll veer right. That will feel wrong. Good. Keep feeling wrong until you come to a cottonwood struck by lightning. It'll be the healthiest tree in the grove, and there's your lesson for the day. From there, the world opens to choices that don't involve him. Eleanor loved her on the spot. Why do you stay here? Eleanor asked, as Agatha wrapped packets of herbs and tucked them into a bag as if preparing a child for school. Because people make trouble at the edges, Agatha said. And I've always liked edges, they clarify. Before they left, Agatha pressed a small wooden cross into Eleanor's palm. It was plain and smooth as a worry stone, the kind of thing a patient grandfather might whittle on a porch to teach a grandchild about corners. Not for belief, she said, for something to hold when the only other thing to hold is fear. She glanced at Jake. And for him to not hold when he is tempted to hold it for you. Outside, shade pooled blue under the cottonwoods. Jake adjusted cinches, then and only then turned to Eleanor as if bracing a post. We can leave you here for a few days, he said. Agatha will peel the danger off you like old bandage. I can draw Vance. Eleanor's no was immediate and whole. He won't stop because I'm not with you. He'll stop when he is stopped. The words surprised them both. They had come from someplace she'd thought dead. Jake searched her face and found the truth there, not because he wanted it, but because he had to. He nodded once. Then we go together, and we stop him by refusing to be where he wants us. They left Willow Bend under a sky that had somehow learned gentleness. At the dry creek bed, Jake took Agatha's wrong feeling right and grinned when the world opened exactly as promised. A long, low valley with grass thick as velvet and a scatter of cattle that looked at them with the minimal interest cattle give anything, not grass. They made camp in a spill of basalt that had cooled into pillars. Jake called it God's organ and tapped one column with his knuckle until it sang, low and fine. Samuel slept as if the day had been designed to teach him that the world sometimes makes sense. Eleanor bundled him with an efficiency that would have made a sergeant salute and then, for the first time since they fled, allowed herself to sit without counting breaths. Jake sat too, and for a moment there was nothing between them but the small scrape of a spoon against a tin plate and the litany of insects in their nightly choir. You said earlier, he began, then stopped. As if someone had requested, he read a letter aloud he had written in private. You said you were tired of men naming debt. I am, she said, but I also know that every kindness in my life came to me on the same road as harm. I don't know how to be grateful without being suspicious, and I hate that. He looked at the fire until it stopped being a thing to look at. Then take this as a contract you write, he said. I won't ask for what isn't given. I won't keep what's taken by fear. I will leave if staying becomes a trap made of my own want. She stared at him, and something with wings moved in her chest, lifted once, and settled. I have nothing to offer, she said. No dowry, no fresh start that isn't already a start and a middle and an end all at once. You have a way of telling the truth that feels like water, he said. You have a boy who laughs in his sleep. You have hands that bleed where other hands would point. The fire cracked very softly, as if in agreement. She reached toward him, then pulled back, not coy, careful. He met her halfway, and the touch they set down between them was not a promise and not a prelude. It was an accounting. Two people added up to more than the cruelty that had tried to subtract them. They slept with the easy exhaustion of the hunted, who have learned, for a night, how to stop measuring dark. When morning came, it brought with it a smell that was not morning. Smoke, old and oiled. Jake was up and moving, face gone to that aligned geometry again. On the ridge to the north, 7 riders paused long enough to let their silhouettes be read. Jeremiah didn't lead today. Pride and a stitched jaw kept him 2 lengths back. A kerchief tied high to hide the wound Eleanor's little pistol had written on his face. Another man, broad, slope-shouldered, with a hatband of rattler, took the front like a dog eager to get his teeth in first. Hired bone. Jake read him at once and did the cold arithmetic of his kind. He adjusted the rifle's sight a hair. First, he said as if to himself, as if teaching a class he'd resisted starting, you remove the man who loves being the first. The shot cracked and the rattler hat lurched, then folded. Horses milled, dust boiled. A second man fired at their flash of camp and hit the organ rock instead, which sang a surprised low note as if the land itself had been struck. Jake fired again, and the singing ceased. Eleanor had Samuel in the notch of her knee, and the derringer in her palm. She did not lift it. She did not need to. The clean economy of Jake's defense told her that the small violence she'd saved for herself had already done its job in a different night. Smoke! Jeremiah barked through cloth, gesturing, and one of his men loosed a bottle with a rag from the neck. It shattered short, lighting only dirt and pride. Another flew long and hissed out harmlessly in an old puddle like a snake thrown against a wall. You could learn a lot about men from the way their plans handled air. Then, a new sound shouldered in from the west. Hoofs in line, not pack. A bell on a saddle that had a church in it instead of a saloon. A voice with authority unpurchased. Vance, it shouted, and the canyon returned the word in 4 different keys. Enough. Sheriff Calder rode with 4 deputies and a doctor's buggy dragging dust like a train of something tidy and official. The sheriff was square as a cupboard and wore his badge like a scar he'd decided to love. He raised a hand. His men stopped their horses perfectly, the way practice makes bodies honest. You got warrants, he called. You got paper? You got anything besides an appetite for other people's things? Jeremiah straightened in his saddle as if his spine had just remembered it was a spine. Sheriff, he said, voice strained by cloth and indignation. This is between me and the— It's between the law and the lawless, Calder said mildly. Which one are you today? People talk about justice like thunder. Calder wore it like shade. He nodded once at Jake, and something passed between the 2 men that wasn't friendship and wasn't relief. It was recognition. We are the kind who stand in front of worse. Lay down arms, Calder said. Hands visible. We will read paper. We will accept testimony. And we will escort you to town like men, not animals. Jeremiah's hand twitched toward his kerchief. Jake, watching his eyes, knew the thought before the man did. Shoot into the cluster. Scream confusion. Take the child. Jake shifted the rifle like a chess piece. Calder saw the same thought arrive in Jeremiah and did not reach for his own gun. He touched the brim of his hat instead. Don't, he said. Not loud, not even just the kind of don't you say to a child standing at the edge of a cliff. And for once, pride saved a life instead of ruining one. Jeremiah spat careful of the stitched jaw and dropped his pistol in the dust. It looked smaller there. His men followed, some slow, some quick, as if speed might convert surrender into strategy. The deputies moved with the beautiful inevitability of a well-made plan. Cuffs clicked. Paper rustled. The doctor in the buggy peered with interest at Jeremiah's wound and raised his brows at Eleanor in a way that said, "You wrote that?" She met his eyes levelly, and his mouth twitched as if he'd discovered a footnote he admired. "Mr. McCall," Calder said when the immediate chaos had cooled to the administrative kind, "always a pleasure to find you on the right side of a mess." "I keep trying to make that a habit," Jake said. Calder turned to Eleanor then, and the crags at his eyes softened. He tipped his hat to Samuel with a solemnity that made the boy blink in a robustly skeptical way. "Mrs. Vance," he said, correctly guessing the name she now wore only as history. "You are under the protection of this county and this office. If anyone tells you otherwise, you send me their name and I'll write it down somewhere. It will bruise." She had not known, until that moment, that a sentence could be a blanket placed over a shiver that had lived in her since Thomas died. "Thank you," she said, 2 words so small compared to what she meant that they felt indecent. "Take your thanks," he said kindly, "and turn it into a hot meal for my men when we ride back through, and we'll call it square." "Done," she said, before remembering she had no kitchen, no oven, no table. Calder saw the thought cross her face like a cloud and chuckled. "Don't fret. I just like to keep gratitude in circulation." He sobered. "There'll be paper," he said. "There'll be talk, but there'll also be quiet if you want it. Get yourselves to some place that asks no questions you don't care to answer." The law rolled away with its small caravan of humiliated violence. Dust settled like exhausted birds. Jake set his rifle down across his thighs and let his shoulders creep back down toward his body. Eleanor realized she'd been standing very straight, as if height could be summoned by will. She sat before her bones, decided to do it for her. "You all right?" he asked again. "Yes," she said, "but I'm something else too." "What's that?" "Hungry," she said, and his laugh, a quick, surprised thing, broke something brittle, the way a tender pick breaks a blister so it can heal. They ate what could be eaten. They drank what could be spared. The word future approached them, cautious as a feral cat. They didn't reach for it. They let it circle. "Where would you go?" she asked finally. "If you could go anywhere that didn't have your shadow already lying on it." He didn't pretend to consider. "A valley near the Mogollon Rim," he said. "Pines tall enough to teach you to look up, water in hollows where deer print it, a woman who sells bread out of a window and pretends it's charity to take a nickel so you feel good buying it. Work you can do with your back. A sky that forgives. That." "And would they forgive me?" she asked, voice small for the first time that day. "The town that buys bread. The sky." "Forgiveness is a thing the sky already decided about you," he said. "Towns take longer. We can give them something better than apology. We can give them proof." "What proof?" she asked. "That we make more than we break." She looked down at Samuel, who had discovered his toes and was addressing them with the gravity of a legislator. "We can do that," she said. "We already have." They packed as if they'd been born to it, which in a way they had. Jake's wound pulled when he cinched the saddle. He pretended it didn't. Agatha's linen held. He lifted Eleanor into the saddle and then, almost shyly, placed his palm at the small of her back for a half-second longer than necessary. She felt the heat of that touch and knew it for what it was. Not claim, not even request, simple, stunned gratitude for the fact of her existence within arm's length of his life. "Ride," he said. So they rode. They followed the cut bank wrong and the lightning tree right. They let the land teach their bodies its grammar. Behind them, Sheriff Calder's tidy, official dust drifted toward a town that would have to learn to live with the idea that there were people in it who would no longer be sold by the pound. Ahead of them, a rim country breathed pine and a hay-sweet wind. Somewhere in it, a baker sold mercy by the loaf. That night, camped in a circle of ponderosa that smelled of vanilla and rain, even when neither was in the air, Eleanor took the rifle in her hands and fired at a knot in a log until the knot gave up. On the last shot she felt the push and pushed back and found that her shoulder did not hurt, and that something far older than her body had hungered for that precise steadiness. "You're a quick study," Jake said. "I had a good teacher," she answered. He moved closer, not much, the way you shift closer to a fire that is already warm. "You want a house?" he asked, voice so casual it trembled. "A real one. Could be small. Could be nothing but a roof that keeps its promises." "I want a life," she said. "The house can be where it lives. Then we'll build that," he said. And he said "we" as if it were a tool he suddenly remembered he owned. She did not lean into him. She did not ask him to lean into her. They lay down near but not touching, the way people do when the possible is so tender it startles at noise. Samuel slept like a saint everyone will misremember later as a miracle worker. The stars wrote nothing for them that night, which was fine. They were ready to write their own. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories. The canyon swallowed sound the way a church swallows prayers, leaving only echoes and the taste of fear. Dust sheared off the walls in ghostly veils as the 5 riders fanned out. Jeremiah, the butcher Vance with his black coat flapping like a carrion bird. Silas Thorne hunched and sweating, and 3 hired pistols whose eyes measured people the way a butcher measures weight. Jake had chosen the choke point wisely. The canyon narrowed to a throat, then opened into a shallow bowl pocked with basalt teeth. He'd marked the places where rockfall made natural breastworks, the angles where the sun would blind a man coming from the west, the range where a colt kept its promise and where it told lies. He breathed once, slow, like a man counting rosary beads he didn't believe in, and said without turning his head, "Stay behind me, Eleanor. Keep Samuel low. Whatever happens, you move when I move." Law. Her hands were white-knuckled on the boy, but her eyes were clear. "I hear you," she said, not a quaver. The first rifle cracked and split the air. A puff of grit sprang from the stone inches from Jake's cheek. He slid left, iron already in his hand, and answered with 3 shots spaced like measured speech. One of Jeremiah's men pitched from the saddle in a shower of reins and dust. The horses screamed high, indignant, living sounds that made the gunfire seem uglier. "McCall," Jeremiah boomed, voice bouncing wall to wall. "I'll salt this place with your blood. You hear me? Then you'll have to get close enough to know what it tastes like," Jake called back, flat as a ledger line. He could feel Eleanor's breath at his shoulder, not panicked, just present, and Samuel's small, brave silence. The canyon became a metronome of bullets. Jake's world tightened to the smells of hot metal, burned powder, and the dry throat tang of caliche dust. He counted reloads he couldn't see, listened for the scrape of a boot sole on shale, and marked the cadence of the men who wanted him dead. One of the hired guns tried to creep along a ledge above their heads. Jake waited until a flicker of hat brim betrayed him, then took him out with a single, ugly smack of lead on bone. Silence fell for a beat. Then the air filled again with angry bees. Eleanor didn't cower. She slid Samuel into the hollow behind a tumbled block and put her own body where the ricochets were least likely. Eyes hunting not for a target Jake had the shooting, but for movement that might mean flanking. She found it. A ribbon of dust slithering along the far right where the canyon floor shelved under a lip of rock. "Jake," she said, steady as a bell tone. "Right bank low, he's crawling. Good eyes." Jake didn't look. He angled his next shot 2 feet ahead of where a man's knee would drag. The man yelped, the bullet snapped the shale, and the ambusher flattened instinctively. Jake's second round found the boot heel that stuck out like a bad idea. The third found everything else. Silas Thorne popped up then, sweat shining like lard on his brow, a pistol in his hand that he held as if it were someone else's problem. "Eleanor," he wheezed, "don't be a fool. Bring the boy. Your uncle will see this made right." "Yes. You sold me," she said. "No volume, no heat, just a fact hung in the noon air like laundry, and you sold my son." Silas blinked at that voice, no tremor, no pleading. The hand with the pistol shook anyway, an old man's tremor riding a coward's arm. "Business is business," he said, and even he seemed to gag on the words. "Debts must be paid." "So must men," Jake said, and shot the rock next to Silas. Stone chips peppered the man's cheek. Silas squealed, dropped his pistol, and cradled his face like a child scolded by the stove. Jeremiah dismounted then, slow and theatrical, as if the canyon were a stage, and the devil paid by the minute. He took a step forward, another, shoulders rolling, a smile that looked carved with a dull knife. "Here we are," he said, voice smooth as old whiskey. "Just you and me, McCall. No ledger between us now. No law." No, the law chose that moment to arrive, hooves drumming the canyon like a parade nobody wanted. Badges flashed Sunday. Blue dust capes resolved into men with rifles held correctly. Sheriff Eli Thorne, Silas's cousin, as it would be whispered later in the saloon with 6 deputies strung out behind. "Lay 'em down!" Eli Thorne's voice cracked big against the walls, years of authority punched through with a vein of fury. "Jeremiah Vance, Silas Thorne, you're under arrest for unlawful sale of persons, conspiracy, and attempted murder." For a fractional second, three futures hung in the hot air. In one, Jeremiah surrendered like a prudent snake. In another, he raised his gun and died where he stood. The third is the one that happened. He lunged, grabbing Silas's dropped pistol with a cat's speed, and turned it toward Eleanor because that was the kind of man he was. Eleanor fired first. The derringer bucked in her hand like a startled bird. The tiny pistol wasn't made for distance or justice, but it was made for close rooms and soft ribs, and Jeremiah had obligingly provided both. The slug hit high in the meat of his shoulder and spun him sideways. His shot went wild, screaming up the canyon and taking a chip off the sky. Then noise, so much noise, deputies shouting, horses skittering, a hired man panicking and bolting only to be shouldered out of the saddle by a deputy's roping shot. Eli Thorne strode forward, lines of disappointment carved deep around his mouth. "Jeremiah, you stupid, pride-blind ox," he said, almost tenderly, before cuffing him so brutally the man sagged. It should have ended there, but the canyon held one more card. A rifle barked from a shadowed fold no one had read, and Jake stumbled as if the ground had sneaked his boot. Eleanor saw the bloom of red creep through his shirt just above the belt, unjust and bright in the bad light. She was moving before she knew she'd decided to, dragging Samuel's blanket to wedge him deeper under the granite lip, then sprinting in a low, quick line the way she'd seen coyotes move across a road. Another shot kissed stone near her ankle. She fell behind Jake's rock and grabbed for him. He was still shooting calmly, angrily, perfectly, but his breath made a sound she never wanted to hear again, a wet catch snagging on pain. "Stop," she said, palms on his cheek, forcing his gaze to meet hers. "Breathe for me." He blinked, green eyes briefly unfocused, then came back to her like a swimmer breaking surface. "I'm fine," he lied. She tore his shirt button, skittered like dice, and saw the wound. Not a through and through. The slug had tunneled and lodged, mean and ragged. The bleeding was steady, but not spurting. She did the math that fear tries to fog and found the answer. He'd live if she made him. "Give me your bandana." She didn't wait. She ripped a strip from her own torn hem, wadded it, and pressed. He hissed from teeth to throat. "I need you angry," she said, voice low and fierce. "Angry at me, not them. Stay with me." Gunsmoke thinned into the baked air. The last of Jeremiah's crew was face down, wrists tied sloppily but effectively with rawhide. Eli Thorne kicked a pistol clear and swore under his breath when he saw Jake go down. "Get a kit," he snapped to a deputy. "And get those two pieces of filth up," he added, pointing at Jeremiah and Silas. "Careful with Vance, he's bit, and he'll bite again." Jeremiah found breath enough to sneer. "It ain't over," he spat. "You can dress it up in law, Eli, but Silverfall belongs to men with iron and coin, and I've got both." Eli's jaw went tight. He leaned close enough that Jeremiah could smell coffee and contempt. "You had both," he said. "Now you have cuffs. That's the difference between a man and a mistake." He straightened and looked at Eleanor, at Samuel's small blanket nest, at Jake bleeding into the dust. Something in the sheriff's face softened, and then rehardened into purpose. "We make camp 2 bends back. There's water and shade. I'm not hauling a wounded man across the floor of an oven." They moved like a river, refinding its channel. Deputies gathered bridles, soothed horses, stripped weapons, and stacked them iron mouth outward. Eleanor lifted Samuel. He'd started to fuss, picking up distress that the air stank of, and tucked him against her shoulder, where his small heart tapped a brave morse on her collarbone. Jake tried to stand and nearly blacked out. "Don't," Eleanor said. "You gave me orders. Now take some." He let her shoulder part of his weight. The concession made him furious and grateful by turns, that man's stew of pride and pragmatism that always tastes of smoke. They made it the 2 bends to the place the sheriff had named, a notch where rock leaned in to make shade, and a sullen trickle stitched through gravel to say the word water. Eli Thorne's deputy Walt, with hands big as shovels and eyes that seemed made for seeing hurt, knelt with a leather roll and unrolled clean. He glanced at Eleanor. "You with him?" She suppressed the urge to say, "I think so. I hope so. I don't know what the word for us is yet." "Yes," she said, and the canyon took the word and tucked it away somewhere. Walt looked once at the wound and nodded to himself. "Lucky," he said. if a bullet can be called that, close to gut, but not in. More muscle than mortal. We'll dig it out clean and keep fever from finding a door." "I'll do it," Eleanor said, surprising both men. "Or I'll help. You tell me how." She didn't tremble. Walt watched her for the half-breath where men decide whether to arm you or pat your head. "All right," he said, and in that all right was respect. "Boil water. Tear me linen. Hold him when I ask." She did all of it. Quick, careful, exact. When the digging came, Jake tried to be silent and only partly succeeded. He crushed his teeth on a word that might have been her name and went gray around the edges. Eleanor held him anyway, held him as if the simple fact of her bones could argue with pain, and when the slug came free, ugly and slick, she felt the tremor go out of him like a weather change. Walt sewed him neat, soldier style, with a thread he'd boiled and hands that had done this too often. He packed it, bandaged it, and said the thing men say at moments like that, "He'll do." Jake crooked a half-smile, more apology than wit. "I've had better afternoons." "You've had worse," Eleanor answered, smoothing a rag damped with cool water over his brow. "And so have I." Around them, the business of consequence ticked along. Eli Thorne had Silas and Jeremiah bound spine to spine at first, then separated when Jeremiah headbutted Silas hard enough to draw snot and blood. "You sanctimonious idiot," Silas rasped, shame making him mean. "You've ruined me." "You did that when you sold a woman," Eli said. He wasn't gentle, but the anger in him wasn't show either. "You don't come back from that. Not here. Not with me wearing the badge." Silas's eyes skittered to Eleanor and away. He found no mercy there, only a ledger returning to balance. "I kept you," he muttered, as if that counted for something. "Roof, food, and—" "You kept me like a spare mule," Eleanor said, the words simple as bread. "And you tried to trade my child for whiskey and fat smiles. If the ground opens for you, I won't throw a rope." Samuel had fallen asleep again, the way children sleep in the middle of storms when someone's arms make a harbor. Eleanor rocked him on her heel as she watched Jake breathe more evenly, watched color creep back over the pallor like sunrise over gravel. She felt strange and steady, battered and new. She had done a hard thing and not broken. She had fired a pistol at a man who would have used her up, and the sky had not fallen. The sky had simply been the sky, huge and indifferent and blue. Eli came to her with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vance," he said. He looked younger with his hat off, the kind of man who remembered his own mother's hands. "I don't expect you care for thanks from a Thorne, given the breed. But I'm sorry for what kin of mine did, and I'll write what I can. Live." She weighed him the way this country teaches you to weigh men as carefully as you weigh flour. "Write it with paper," she said. "Write the words that say I'm not property. Write the words that say my boy is mine and will never stand on a block again." He nodded, relief plain because he'd feared she would ask for blood he could not lawfully spill. "You'll have it," he said, "a writ with the seal, and protection until you're gone from this county if gone is what you decide." "Listen." "Gone," Jake said hoarsely, and tried to sit taller. "We're gone." He met Eleanor's gaze, asked a question he didn't know how to phrase, and found the answer in the way she didn't look away. Jeremiah laughed then, ugly and wet. "Run," he said. "Run, little rabbits. I'll be there when you stop. There's always a man with $1 more and a thirst for other folks' hurt." Eli backhanded him, not hard enough to be a cruelty, just hard enough to be punctuation. "You're done talking," he said. "I'm tired of your voice." They waited out the worst heat in the seam of shade. A wind came up that smelled faintly of creosote and rain 100 miles away. Walt doled sips of water. The deputies kept watch without fuss, and the canyon slowly unclenched. As the sun tipped toward a merciful angle, they moved again, careful, organized, the way good outfits move. Eli rode ahead with 2 men and the prisoners between. A rope from Jeremiah's wrists to his saddle horn that said, "I know what you are and how you try." Another pair flanked the small knot that was Eleanor, Jake, and the boy. Walt walked with the bay's rein in his fist, so Jake didn't have to sit a saddle yet, not with stitches new and pain still prowling. Eleanor walked by Jake's side, her shoulder near his hand if he needed it. They didn't talk much. The kinds of words you say after a thing like that are small, and small words don't fit in the big silence that follows violence. But some words can live there. You shot him, Jake said finally, voice rasped sandpaper. Not accusation. Inventory. I did, she said. I'll dream of the moment. I'll dream of what would have happened if I didn't. He swallowed. I don't want that for you. You wanted living for me, she answered. This is the price. I'll pay it. That. They reached the canyon mouth as the light turned gold and forgiving. Beyond, the country unrolled in its rough beauty, the thorn and the cottonwood, the slow wriggle of a creek that might last to August if it felt kind, the far blue of mountains that looked like promises. Eli called a halt and checked his prisoners, then looked back at Jake. I'll put them in iron, he said. Then I'll write what needs writing. His gaze shifted to Eleanor again. You'll be safe tonight. Tomorrow you travel how you please. If you head for the pines west of town, there's a stand that breaks the wind and a spring that never lies. He scratched a quick map in the dust with his boot heel, the shorthand of men who've been lost and found again by landmarks and luck. Eleanor memorized it the way she'd memorized scriptures as a child, quick, complete, with the fear that forgetting might cost too much. She nodded once. We'll go there. That's Marshall out of Prescott'll want words, Eli added. He'll want to make news of this. He'll look at you and call you a witness or a victim. He paused, not quite smiling. You look like neither to me. I look like a mother, she said, and a woman who's done with being sold. The sheriff settled his hat and gave them something that wasn't quite a salute. That'll do, he said, and touched heels to his horse. The small column clanked away, dust making its brief brown blessing in the low light. When they were alone enough, Eleanor and Walt guided Jake off the road and into the first fingers of pine. The smell of resin took the sunburn out of the day. Birds argued branch to branch, offended by visitors, then decided to forgive them. Jake's weight leaned a little heavier on Eleanor's arm, and she bore it without thinking, until the bearing itself became the thought, I can hold him. I can hold this. They found the place Eli had promised, a dark, sweet-smelling pocket where needles made a soft floor and rock gathered the seep of water into a tiny, stubborn pool. It felt like a mercy you didn't dare thank aloud for fear of spooking it. Walt showed Eleanor how to freshen the bandage without pulling the whole work apart. You keep it clean, he said. No whiskey, no creek water on it. If he gets a fever, you cool him straight, and you send for me or for Doc Tully. He looked at her, not at Jake when he said the next part. He'll want to ride tomorrow. Don't let him. He keeps to a walk, and he keeps his mouth shut about being fine. I can be stubborn, Jake murmured, eyes closed. So can she, Walt said mildly. Looks like you met your match. He tipped his hat, the way a man does to a person who's proven they're not decoration, and left them to the trees in the evening. Night came on like a scarf laid over the land. Eleanor built a fire, small and wise heat without beacon, and warmed water over it, the domestic miracle she used to take for granted. Samuel ate and slept, the way the young teach the old about what matters. Jake drifted between pain and the edges of sleep, and when his hand twitched toward his side, she caught it and gave him other work to do, her fingers to hold, breath to match, a voice to follow back. She thought of the auction block and how the sun had felt like judgment. She thought of Jake's back broad against the day and of what it meant to stand between someone and the worst of the world. She thought of papers, seals, words that would say no in a way even men like Silas had to obey. But mostly she thought of the sound Jake made when he tried not to groan and couldn't help it, and how that sound went through her not like fear but like resolve. You're all right, she told him. And she didn't know until she said it that she believed it. You're here. You're with us. Us, he repeated, the words slurring into something that sounded like prayer. Us. Much later, when the fire had folded itself down to coals, when the pines sang their slow, high song to the wind, when the stars decided to risk themselves above the country again, Jake stirred and found her watching him. There was moonlight on her cheek and soot on her wrist, and a cut she hadn't noticed on the back of her hand where a shale edge had been cruel. Eleanor, he said. She leaned in so he didn't have to spend himself on volume. Yes? I'm not alone, he said, as if the sentence were hill country, and he was walking it one careful step at a time. Not anymore. No, she said. Not anymore. He fell back into sleep then, the clean kind that men. And in that pocket of pine and stubborn water, in the first safe dark they'd had in days, Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself imagine a morning that didn't begin with running. The thought felt dangerous and necessary at once. At dawn they would break the embers and drink from the spring, and start toward the map the sheriff had scratched. She would keep the pace and keep the boy, and keep the man alive. They would go back to the world long enough to claim papers with seals and names that meant hers and his and not for sale. After that, they would choose the road that led away. But for now, she put her palm flat to Jake's chest and felt the slow, sure drum that said, "Still here." The desert listened with all its ears. No miracle announced itself. No choir of angels split the pre-dawn. Just breath. Just the quiet knock of a heart refusing to quit. Just a woman who had fired at a monster and hit. A child who dreamed without fear. And a man who would wake to find he'd promised himself